And it's time now to move to our third panel, ably moderated by Jay Shepard, whom you will all know, and if you don't, his and all the other bios are in your program. Session number 3, which will run for 1 hour, 15 minutes, utility business models. Over to you, Jay, and your colleagues.
Hi. So I promised Richard faithfully that we would say some controversial things today. It will be a challenge. We'll have to work at it, but we'll try our best. I want to start by telling you 2 brief stories. Over the last week, I've been talking to people about DER because A, I need to get a life, but also B, because I was interested because of this. And one person who is the energy manager of a large institutional customer said to me, in his view, the cost of electricity is going to go to 30 cents before he retires. He's in his early 50s. And as a result, his job right now is to reduce the exposure of his employer to centrally generated electricity. If possible, get off the grid. I don't know what their load is, but it's substantial. And the second person said to me that his view is that sometime over the next decade, there's going to be some wires assets for sale real cheap, and he wants to buy them. That's his plan right now, is to be able to buy wires assets for pennies on the dollar. So I guess with that backdrop, I want to talk a little bit about, to sort of set the stage a bit for the speakers. There's 2 things you have to keep in mind here. One is that this problem of a business under challenge by outsiders, that's not new. It's normal in the competitive markets. You ask Jim Balsillie and Mike Lazaridis of BlackBerry what they know about that, they'll tell you. Or does anybody remember when IBM was a mainframe company? They sell a lot of mainframes now? Or OpenText, I know OpenText quite well. They were in the search engine business. They're not in that business anymore. Many of you use OpenText, not as a search engine. The point is that the issues facing utilities today are not new. Disruption of existing business models is the heart of the free market system. And so there are tried and true ways of responding to a challenge from outside, and our speakers are going to talk about those things. The second point, general point, context if you like, is that many, maybe even most of the options that are available to utilities under threat are to enter competitive markets. But that has 2 problems. First of all, how do you ensure a level playing field? And we're going to talk about that a bit. If you adopt a business model that means you compete with competitive companies but you're still a monopoly, how is that fair, and how do you make sure that's fair? And secondly, is the competitive business model a viable model for a utility? Do you have the skill set? Is that what you do? Act in a competitive market? Because, and we've seen this in the past, some utilities that have tried to go into competitive markets have found that they have a skill set. They're very good with customers, they're very good thinking long term, but the nimbleness that is necessary in a competitive market is not something they've ever had to build. And so it's hard for them. And so I'm going to use those 2 as a backdrop to set the stage for the 4 very good speakers we have. Ken Costello from NRI, Steve McGill, who said thank you that I'm not cross-examining him today, little does he know, from Enbridge, Greg Van Dusen from Hydro Ottawa, and Gord Reynolds from Spark Solar. And so we're going to start with Ken.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be here. I'm Ken Costello. I'm with a group called the National Regulatory Research Institute. We're the research arm for the state utility commissions in the U.S. I'm not an advocate of commissions or support what they always do. I'm an objective analyst, and sort of look at things from the public interest perspective, what commissions should do. Not that they always do. To get to the chase, I talk about business sort of models, sort of, looking at some basics. When you look at the literature and business models, sort of in a commercial sense, it's a model that firms should adopt to make money. I mean, that's what commercial enterprises are. And if you sort of break that down to different components, basically a company has to provide value to the customers. And the customers have to value that service enough so that the company is able to earn a profit, that the company recovers its costs and makes some money. And in the sense that what's happening in the industry, especially the electric industry, to some extent the gas industry, each of the sort of the components, each of those three elements need to be revisited. For example, we're seeing a lot of customers now are becoming more active, but yet the vast majority of customers, at least in the U.S., I assume Ontario, are still sort of traditional customers. They pay their bill. They may have a complaint if they have a billing problem, but otherwise, they look at their bill. If they're satisfied, they're happy. They're content. Increasingly, you got other customers who want to become more engaged. They want clean energy. They want more control over their bills, and they want this and that. And more of those customers are going to exist in the future. But I'm not sure. I mean, that's sort of a question we should address in this panel. To what extent will customers become engaged? What percentage of them? One way to look at a business model, it does encompass different components, things we talked about earlier today: rate making, the role of the utility, what services the utility should provide, and also for utility to achieve sort of public policy objectives. One difference in my mind between a sort of a commercial business model and a utility business model is that the utility model basically has to include a structure where the utilities are advancing social objectives. It's sort of what Milton Friedman used to say was a social responsibility of business is just to make money, because in making money, the firm is providing a valuable service to society, and that's sort of their social goal. But when you look at utilities, their functions are more wide, and they have more obligations and something. Again, that sort of gets into the question, if the utilities want to compete, if they're burdened with these costs, then is it unfair to the utility or not? That's probably a discussion we'll have a little bit. What should a business model do? I mean, sort of if you look at it from the utility perspective, it's sort of make sure we got enough revenues for financially viable. All right, I know in the States that's sort of what the utilities are advancing. Some of our markets being eroded, we're losing revenue, and we got to change the way we price. We got to change sort of the role that we can play. A lot of utilities in the U.S. are constrained from entering into other activities, non-utility activities. And the utilities are saying, well, maybe we, to counteract lost revenues from losing sales to our core customers, we should be able to enter competitive markets. But sort of from my perspective, if you're a regulator, or a policymaker, you got to me the criteria is looking at long-term welfare of customers. I mean, that's sort of the reason why we institute a regulation. I have to remind our regulators in the U.S. Often that basically the utility would operate in a monopoly environment and without regulation. And basically the intent of regulation should basically to make sure that the welfare of customers are adequate and to enhance. So when you look at a business model to change it, I think you have to look at that sort of perspective of what's the effect, the long-term effect on customers. And, reasonable people could disagree for that. Innovation. I think if you look at the business models in the U.S. and probably here in Ontario, there's not strong incentives for utilities to innovate. And innovation, I think, is important at this time because there's the emergence of a lot of these new technologies. Now, you could ask the question, and hopefully we'll address it, who should who should deploy the innovation more? Should we expect a utility or third parties to come in there to create an environment, to have a business model where third parties will, have the incentives and the ability to provide their services to customers, okay? And another thing, when you look at business models too, it's sort of the premise on the objectives. What's the objectives that a utility should have? Which is based partly on policy and the fact that they're a commercial enterprise. How can you achieve those objectives at least cost? I see, a big sort of inefficiencies of regulation in the U.S. at least is that objectives are being achieved but not at the lowest cost. For example, like solar. For example, utility scale solar is like half the price of rooftop solar. So maybe the policy should be is to promote utility scale solar over VP solar because it's so much cheaper. And again, something we could discuss. The utility model has probably worked pretty well in the past, but the question is we have a confluence of a lot of changes, technological changes, more customer engagement, different public policy. So the question is, given those, should we change the business model? And typically in other industries, when the environment, the landscape changes, firms have to revisit their business model. Because if they don't, then that's one reason why they failed. There's other reasons as well, but that's a major reason. And then there's sort of the question is who should actually decide whether there's a need for a new business model or not and what form it takes. At least in the States, a lot of times it's the regulators sort of, taking the initiative or at least co-partly opening up a hearing like in New York to discuss whether whether we need a new business model or not. I don't think it's, the utilities certainly should have a role to play, a large role, but they should not be the sole party. Because to implement a business model properly, there has to be a good alignment of regulatory practices and policies or government public policy. If the policy is to accommodate third parties, DERs, then you have to have the proper regulatory policies in place. Otherwise, they could act counter to that. And then there's it could be an error in choosing the wrong business model. Maybe we can move too fast. I don't endorse necessarily what New York is doing. In most states in the U.S., they're just watch and seeing. I think that was sort of discussed earlier in the last session. Or session before, trial and error. You watch what the leaders do. You watch what California do in New York. If they screw it up, then you can learn from that and do the right thing. It's sort of a public good, New York. That's the way I tell regulators that it's a public good, and you can learn from others. You don't have to be the leader. So I'm going to finally a quote from Laura Keynes that seems appropriate. The difficulty lies not with new ideas, but in escaping old ones. Okay. In other words, inertia stifles necessary change. But not certainly to dispute Laura Keynes, my gosh. Sometimes sticking with old ideas is not such a bad thing, especially when new ideas are being exploited for personal gain or for ideological reasons at the expense of the general public. I see some of that going on, too. I attend a lot of regulatory meetings, and I see all these vendors and parties come in trying to sell, their wares, and you wonder, that's a tough job of the policymaker is to determine, which of those are in the public interest. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ken. And Steve?
Okay. Thanks, Jay. Hi. Just to start out with a little story, and I guess it was 3 or 4 years after I left university, I was asked back to speak to some students about, how you could make a career in business with a geography degree. And I bumped into one of the people there that had taught me in the past, a fellow named Ted Ralph, and at the time, I just had, my son was born, he was about a month old, there was a lot of sleepless nights. I was telling Professor Ralph about that, and his comment was, well, it doesn't change, it just gets different. And that was based on his experience with his teenage sons at that point in time. So I think that's kind of a theme of what we have to look at here. So from the standpoint of what a regulated energy distribution company is, it's a natural monopoly. And that notion came about, I guess, early in the last century, maybe 100 years or so ago, when there was a lot of the tenets that we go by now in terms of the way we're regulated on a cost of service basis were formed and developed. And some of the characteristics that constitute that natural monopoly are expensive, long-lived, fixed assets that can't be moved around, and that gave rise to the notion of dedicated franchise areas or service areas, and the whole aspect of, because of that, we needed a proxy for competition. We have price regulation. So if I go back to the old consumers' gas days, and at that point in time, part of the way we built the business was through what we would call today maybe non-utility or ancillary or behind-the-meter program. So if you talk to people outside of Ontario or southern Ontario and you ask them about renting a hot water heater, they'll sort of look at you like you have two heads. You know, what are you talking about? But in this province, there's well over 1 million people that rent their hot water heaters today. So, and that was a product of the way the gas utilities operated back before the turn of this century. So, in terms of transition, we've gone through a number of them. You know, these companies, they started out providing gas lighting for street lights with manufactured gas that was manufactured from coal in the south part of the city here, in the case of Toronto. And then in the 1950s, we moved to natural gas that came from Western Canada through Trans-Canada pipelines. And then in the late 1990s, through an exercise in unbundling, and I think the interest of competition for some of those retail businesses, they were moved out of the utility. So a lot of the things we're talking about here today sort of are having us go back and reassess some of those models that were in place in the past and trying to determine whether they have a place in our future or not, and if so, how, and how they can be constructed to take some of today's interests into account. So some of the things that are driving us today, so in the electric side, it seems to be, at least based on today's discussion, the big topic is distributed generation. And in the gas business, our biggest single concern today is how we manage in an environment near of carbon pricing. So today, in some respects, our two systems are integrated in that the predominant gas load or demand is for space heating, which means that the electric industry doesn't have to build the assets to meet that peak that would probably operate at a very poor load factor. So in many ways, although I don't think it was done in a very coordinated way, the two systems have been integrated in such a way to sort of optimize the economics of the energy business in this province. So some of the things we're facing today is electricity costs are high, natural gas costs are low. Even with the province's recent price reductions in electricity, we're about 60% cheaper than electricity to heat and heat hot water with right now. The other things we have to face are technology advancements. So in terms of energy consuming equipment, controls, automation, and then just information technology itself and the ability to inform people and influence their behavior through things like the Nest thermostat or the ecobee. We have these tools that are just coming into being now that I think have the opportunity to help us shape demand and manage costs in a more proactive way than we have in the past. So how can we respond to that? And I think it's a matter of going back and taking a look at, as utilities, you know, what some of our strengths are. You know, so in the case of Enbridge, really only about 10% of the company's assets now are energy distribution assets in Ontario. We have a low cost of capital. We have a large, diverse customer base. We have strong brands. We have a safety culture, and I think a lot of integrity. Some of the things we have to overcome, I think, to be successful in this new world are becoming faster to market, getting past some of our barriers in terms of risk tolerance. So I think we've got a lot of strengths as utility businesses, and we have some challenges as well. So with that, I'll hand it back to Jay and move to Greg.
Thanks. Greg?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here today. I appreciate that. In my opening remarks, I'd like to advance 4 basic propositions about the utility business model. The first is that the existing business model is no longer durable. The second is don't quite write an obituary for LDCs quite yet, though. We need to manage our PRs very carefully, and I'll explain what the PRs, capital P, capital R, are in a few minutes. And most importantly, the last point is business models that put customers first will ultimately win out. So let me go to my first point, that the existing business model is no longer durable. First, let me talk a little bit about what's happening at Hydro Ottawa. Hydro Ottawa shares the increasingly prevailing view that the existing business model is not very durable anymore, and there's several reasons why. Customers love our product, but they're using less of it. Utilities are actually helping customers use less of our product. In fact, we have to. We participate in CDM programs. And utilities aren't the only game in town, too, with respect to reducing electricity usage. For example, thanks to many cogeneration plants, many universities and hospitals are relying less on the grid today than they ever did before. Likewise, you see the installation of solar panels is getting more within the reach of customers every day. The movement into Ontario to net metering as well will help amplify this. And now, of course, distributed energy resources are on the horizon. So to use a bit of an exaggeration or an illusion, you might say that the old business model was a one-trick pony, but the horse is out of the barn now. So looking ahead, we feel that the only real questions are how and how quickly will change occur. So my second point was, do we write off the LDCs as they exist now? And the answer is no. For many utilities, a new way of doing business will require cultivating a competitive posture and diversifying into new lines of business. In fact, it may even mean that the utility competes against itself, regulated versus unregulated side. Some utilities may not survive, and leaving them no other option but consolidation or end of business for them. But I would like to caution against sounding the death knell for utilities. Consider the following. Many utilities aren't standing still and are already adapting. Looking across Ontario, and as we heard this morning, you'll find utilities and their affiliates demonstrating virtual power plants, deploying microgrids and storage, and generating new revenue. In fact, for Hydro Ottawa, we now earn 80% of our revenue from the regulated business and 20% from the non-regulated business. The scales are set to tip more in terms of the non-regulated business in the upcoming years as well. Second point, competition is a two-way street. Maintaining a level playing field is an imperative that applies to utilities and their competitors alike. For example, net metering in some jurisdictions has provided unfair advantage to certain participants. Where access to and benefits from the grid are involved, everyone needs to receive their fair share and a fair shake. Third point, in light of competition's bidirectional flow, policymakers, regulators are already allowing utilities to pursue other businesses. Here in Ontario, the Ontario Energy Board Act was amended in 2015 to lift certain business restrictions on utilities and their affiliates. We've talked a fair bit already today about the reforms in New York State and how they have supported utilities playing a role as platform providers for markets at the distribution level. In California, regulators realized that restricting utility investments in EV charging infrastructure wasn't conducive to boosting the deployment of EVs, and they changed their course. We're also seeing that distributed energy resources are actually allowed to be rate-based in some jurisdictions as well. These are excellent case studies in the promise and potential of new business models and how suitable parameters can be put in place to mitigate the anti-competitive impacts. Fourth point, consumption patterns are in decline for now, but a reversal upwards is a real possibility. Certainly here in Ontario, with respect to the Climate Change Action Plan and in other jurisdictions, the public consensus around decarbonization of the economy has sharpened, and this makes sense and makes the case for greater electrification of sectors like transportation very compelling. And the last point, but a very important point, the depth of expertise within utilities is enormous. Utilities have sometimes gotten the reputation of being dinosaurs, but there are many things that we do exceptionally well. Harnessing the laws of physics and the ability to deliver electricity reliability is one of them. But there's a lot of knowledge in the people and what we do. Utilities are therefore well positioned as society transitions to a knowledge economy where brain power is the greatest asset, input, and resource. And we believe we have it. Now, come to my third point, which is managing our PRs carefully. So the PRs here talk about process, prescription, and prediction. So what's the best process for utilities to seek approval for new business models and for other parties to weigh in? Jurisdictions that are further down this road have convened formal processes to facilitate early, open, and frequent dialogue on this and other questions. Ontario still has some more work to do in this area. Prescription. The renewed regulatory framework in place here, put in place by the Ontario Energy Board, is meant to be principles-based and not prescriptive. We need to resist the urge to prescribe new business models for utilities and instead promote innovation and flexibility under some reasonable safeguards. Prediction. Disruption makes it tempting to bet on winners and losers, but our track record in predicting the future is relatively weak. Accordingly, the utility business continues to shift. We ought to forbear from predetermining and prejudging outcomes. My last point I'd like to make, and probably the most important, is it's my firm belief that the business model of the future that puts customers first will be the one that ultimately wins out. Utilities have a long history of getting to know their customers and serving their customers. And ultimately, what matters most is putting customers first. Experience has shown that companies which succeed amidst disruption are able to meet a tangible need of the customer base. It would be no different in our sector, whether the provider is an incumbent or a disruptor, or whether the solution is wired or wireless. So in conclusion, I just want to sum up the 4 points. The utility business model is changing irrevocably. Don't write utilities off quite yet. Let's tread carefully with our processes, prescriptions, and predictions. And customer first is a winning business opportunity for the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Greg. And now, Gord, of course, it appears that every panel has somebody who's supposed to disagree with everybody else. So that's you. And I'm told I'm allowed to too, but you're the designated it. So Gord?
I think that's your day-to-day role, but today I get to take that from you. So thanks very much for the opportunity to participate today. As a market participant that is often viewed as a disruptor, we don't always get the opportunity to participate in panels like this, so it's appreciated. Just a little bit about us as a company. Spark Solar is part of the Spark Power Group. We're an integrated energy service provider. We deliver fairly traditional technical services to asset management companies, project development services, maintenance and service, as well as operational support, primarily to the renewable energy sector as well as to ICI customers. We have a number of diversified assets across those sectors, and our approach really is customer-focused. We believe that the industry is in the early stages of a fairly large-scale shift, and that shift is towards a more diversified, technology-driven, and ecologically minded solution set. We also believe that the industry is transforming from what has been a fairly dull unilateral monopoly to an integrated network containing multiple types of producers and consumers. and that our goal is to really activate the next generation of the energy system by empowering a more diverse client base to maximize their assets and their investments through more sustainable, renewable, and in many cases, personalized energy solutions. We do remain a strong supporter and a respecter of the past, and we support traditional energy businesses like utilities, but we also understand and are committed to the need for more sustainable energy solutions. So as a company, through some pretty sustainable or aggressive growth and a number of acquisitions, we've grown to 400 employees and about 4,500 customers since we were started in late 2009. We were founded as an M&A firm and investment bank in response to the Green Energy Act. So as a company, we have been committed exclusively to delivering green energy to Ontario from the beginning. We currently maintain and operate over 2,000 solar and wind energy assets in the province and have over 500 megawatts of renewable power under management. We also created and continue to manage two of Canada's largest energy co-ops, Agris Solar Co-op in southwestern Ontario and the Green Energy Cooperative Ontario, which is also known as GECO. We also have a community of over 3,000 farmers and business people through member-owned renewable energy co-ops here in Ontario. So with respect to shifting utility models, there's been a lot of doom and gloom messaging around the utility market in recent years, and certainly not helping that is the sky-high electricity prices that are really, I guess, #1 concern for Ontario voters. It's really placed the existing provincial government at an all-time low in the polls, and despite the recent announcement to reduce electricity pricing for consumers, the industry's really struggling to keep up with energy costs. LDCs are being faced with challenge of their shifting business models to accommodate the emerging markets. So it's not always easy to be optimistic. But we do believe as a company that a positive outlook comes not from seeing the circumstances as they are today, but instead focusing on the opportunities before us. And regardless of what the legislative changes are that we'll see in the coming months and years, we don't really believe in the death spiral for utilities as a foregone conclusion. Instead, we're really more excited about the opportunities that a clean energy future and more robust grid will inevitably bring for a number of participants. Certainly, industry research again and again predicts that the creation of services that are customized to meet of individual customers will be a key for Canada's future electricity system. And as the energy industry continues its evolution towards programs like virtual net metering or grid-tied solar that's behind the meter, we believe that the results will be a more cost-effective power for customers, more sustainable load growth, and a smarter, more reliable grid. The federal government's plans to spend almost $22 billion on green infrastructure over the next little over a decade, that there's no question that the traditional business models will need to change, and that will be really to accommodate new market conditions, an evolved industry, and social trends. The competition for revenue is going to be fierce, no doubt, with new non-utility players like Spark entering the race for customers' mind share and their workforce, which is an important element of this. We believe that the new business models are changing the way consumers look at LDCs here in Ontario, and will make it absolutely necessary for utilities to develop new strategies to meet the demands not just of their customers, but of the regulators and their shareholders. Thank you.
Thanks. So this is the point in time when you guys have to start thinking of good questions. You note that the questions come through me. I'm only going to ask the challenging ones, so if you have softball questions, forget it. I'm just not going to ask them. But it is up to you and to think of some good questions. Meanwhile, I'm going to ask a couple to get the discussion started. And let's start with this. If you're and we'll start with you, Greg, because you brought it up. The utility business model is the existing utility business model is no longer viable, no longer durable. So there's basically two ways that you as a utility can respond. You can respond with looking at it as an opportunity. You can say, okay, let's look for growth, let's look for expanded scope, new products and services, and maybe a new corporate culture. That's one way you can go. And the other way you can go is you can treat it as a threat, the changes as a threat, and see this as a survival activity. So you look for regulatory protections, you look for getting more things within your protected regulatory walls, you look for exit fees and different rate-making structures, and you try to move away from the emphasis on obligation to serve and more on an emphasis of your customers having an obligation to purchase. So there's those two directions you can go in. So Greg, you want to start off with what are your considerations if you're a Hydro Ottawa or somebody like that in looking at that?
Well, I can say quite definitively that Hydro Ottawa sees this as an opportunity. We're taking a look at growth. We're taking a look at other businesses we can get into. As was stated earlier, I think, Jay, in your opening remarks, businesses change. You have to be ready to adapt to that change, to be agile, to move forward. So there are some aspects, it's hard to ignore some aspects of the proposition which is in front of us that are scary. There's no question about that. But there's no question, we see it as an opportunity. We want to take a look at two things. One, our non-regulated business and revenue from there. And as I've sort of led on, I think LDC should be able to play in the competitive playing field in the future with DERs. Now, there's items around that are problematic and need to be addressed, but I think with the appropriate safeguards, that would be the way that we'd like to look at it.
Maybe I could go to Gord next. You're sort of on the other side. Depending on how utilities react, how does that affect you?
So I think it's both. And when we talk about utilities, we have a number in the province that have both a regulated business, which is often where they started, and then unregulated affiliates. It's certainly, as Greg mentioned, it's a great opportunity for unregulated affiliates of LDCs to enter the market. Obviously, as a market participant that doesn't have some of the inherent benefits of being a utility, we aren't always in support of that. And certainly their regulated utilities should and often do consider evolving business models to be a threat. Unfortunately, that is more often the case than the view of Hydro Ottawa, where they see it as an opportunity. And certainly we've chosen to exclusively work with LDCs that share our view that there is opportunity in the market.
Do you find, I'm not letting you off that easy, do you find that where utilities try to maximize their monopoly advantage in order to defend themselves, that you have any difficulty competing with them?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, so the biggest threat for DERs right now, obviously, is grid-connected generation, traditionally solar. With the FIT model going away, it's really net metering, and whatever will come with that with the changes to the upcoming legislation and regulation. The reality is the vast majority of those applicants get denied for reasons like feeder or station constraints, which of course are not open to dispute or challenge. So for most industry participants, they struggle to enter the market with solutions like that because the utilities protect that. Whether that's a deliberate effort on the part of the LDCs to maintain control over that domain, or whether it is just poor oversight of the folks that own the exclusive privilege of controlling the grid, I couldn't tell you.
So Steve, in your long history at Enbridge, Sorry. Steve and I are good friends, so I'm allowed to rag him a bit. You've seen this whole discussion about whether changes in the marketplace and changes in the model are an opportunity or a threat. And so you've been there at the table when you've talked about it. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, I think we view the changes we're looking at as opportunities. We have a number of things that we're investigating now, and some of them are closer to fruition than others. Some of them relate to the electricity side of the business. Renewable natural gas is a big opportunity to abate carbon. We're in the process of commissioning a hydrogen energy storage project in conjunction with the IESO. That plant should be up and running this summer. And we've collaborated. We have an agreement with the Ontario Geothermal Association to pursue geothermal installations in the residential mass market. Micro CHP, we've run tests on that in the past. And other things like district energy, more natural gas vehicles, energy storage. And what we're looking at are businesses that are or can be made to be what we call utility-like. So although they may not fall into the category of a traditional rate-regulated utility, they would hold a lot of similarities in terms of the way they're operated, the way they're structured, the financial model that they're built upon. So we believe that those are ways that we can take advantage of some of those strengths that I talked about earlier to help advance some of these other lines of businesses going forward.
So you're, at Enbridge, you're looking at business models that play on your existing strengths and your existing corporate culture rather than trying to change the corporate culture to get into a different business.
I think the culture has to change to some extent, but I think it's also a matter of utilizing those strengths that we have as a company that's been in business for a long time. The original Consumers Gas started in Toronto in 1848. We have electricity or renewable generation assets all over North America. So I think there's lots within our organization that we can draw upon. And I think I indicated earlier that the gas distribution business in Ontario only makes up about 10% of what Enbridge is in terms of total assets. So when we go and look into that organization for the abilities and strengths and talents they have, there's a lot more for us to draw on than what we have just here locally in Ontario.
Okay. Ken, you've seen this question of opportunities versus threats over the years?
It's a tough, I mean, this goes back probably, in the 80s when I first started in regulation with the telecom industry too, as it was being restructured, whether the local bell companies could get into other activities. And generally, the regulators at that time did allow them. They gave them a lot of flexibility. There was implementation on wide scale, what's called price cap regulation. Opportunities for the telecoms to, provide other services, but I would say in general, if you look at sort of from the U.S. perspective, regulators are sort of reluctant for utilities to get into sort of, other sort of non-core activities, non-utility activities. Basically, there's, you look at the benefit of a utility being, getting involved. There may be, economies of scope, or in today's context, it may allow a utility to recover some of its lost revenues from core customers, okay? So that's sort of on the plus side. But on the minus side, it depends how you structure this new entity, or how these services are going to be provided. Is it going to be provided through a division of the utility, or is it structurally separated? And regulators, at least from my experience, are are leery of these operations in terms of potentially resulting in cost shifting, discriminatory access of the utilities or distribution or essential facilities. So it's a tough question, certainly, and there's risk in both. But where I come down is, if there's protection, and as long as the utility isn't using ratepayer money to finance these other entities, then you could, it's probably you can make a good case that they should be allowed.
I'm going to riff off that a little bit. I have 3 questions here, lengthy questions, because they're trying to be controversial, that all go towards the same thing. The first is on the assumption that the only components of an LDC, for example, that should be monopolistic are ones that are not competitive. Is it right to say that any other business should not be carried out by the LDC but by an unregulated company, whether it's affiliated or not? The second is, should LDCs or other utilities be able to subsidize their competitive service offerings by virtue either of the sharing costs and maybe artificially low costs to the competitive entity, or by relying on the appearance that customers are dealing with the utility? And the third is, how should the utilities that are in competitive businesses be regulated? That is, if they should their rate of return be adjusted if they're in competitive businesses, or should they be allowed to cover the losses in their competitive businesses through their regulated businesses? So these are some of the level playing field issues that I've been working on since, I'm not even going to say how long, longer than Steve. And so I'm going to put that sort of general set of level playing field questions to you guys, and I'm going to start with you, Steve, because you have more experience on this than anybody, I think.
So I guess the first part of the question as to whether or not utilities should be allowed to operate in competitive areas, I guess my response would be, why not? If we are able to compete and we can deliver the products and services that people need and want on a competitive basis, then I think that would be a benefit overall from the standpoint of the economy. I guess the second thing, and at Enbridge we've had a lot of experience over this through the years, is it becomes down to a matter of cost allocation and making the determination or allowing the regulator to make the determination that there aren't subsidies from the regulated line of business onto the non-regulated lines of business. So for example, we've been running our natural gas vehicle program since somewhere around 1985. And for a good part of that time, it was treated as what we refer to as an ancillary business program. And the test has been that on a standalone basis, with fully allocated costs, that program has to return the same regulated rate of return as the rest of the utility business. And for many years, it under-earned, and the company had to face imputed revenues that came out of the shareholders' pocket to really subsidize the rate of return of that program. Now, the last 2 or 3 years, it's beat or exceeded our regulated return. And now that extra earnings has found its way into our earnings sharing model. So to the extent it over-earns, 50% of that is going to subsidize rates.
So how's that bad?
Well, I think we could talk about a bilateral approach. But that's just an example of how a business can work within a regulated utility over a long, long period of time. And now with the advent of carbon pricing, I think it's got the potential to come into its own, especially with long-trawl trucking and return-to-base fleet vehicles. And we're starting to see big take-up there. City of Toronto, I think it's about 120 garbage trucks they have just purchased that'll be fueled by natural gas. So I think there's ways to make it work.
It sounds like, though, you're agreeing with the implication in the question that there can't be any cross-subsidy of the regulated business and the unregulated business. Is that?
Well, I think
right? Or there shouldn't be.
I think as a general rule there shouldn't be, but I think there are probably exceptions to that. I think if we're trying to get new things off the ground, I think one of the examples that's in play right now is renewable natural gas. And in order to get that into our grid, there may be some subsidy required in order to make that happen today. And that's sort of an investment in bringing that renewable resource into the market today and getting that industry on its feet in Ontario.
So I'm going to go to Gord, I think, so on the other side. Do you think that, talk about the level playing field issues that I've raised.
So certainly for this foreseeable future, LDCs have a role to play as the custodians of the infrastructure that we've talked about today is so critically important to us. But the vast majority of us who have lived on both sides of both regulated and unregulated parts of the business would agree that, with all due respect to our utility leaders, if they were held to a standard that most unregulated businesses are, they would fail miserably. I would go so far as to say that most of the LDCs in Ontario are probably some of the worst run businesses in Canada. And to subsidize them by allowing them to enter into competitive businesses at which they're probably likely to fail, and there's good examples of those in Ontario already, some of them at great expense to their municipal shareholders, is just a failed path.
So I take it you're saying A, no subsidy of the unregulated business by the regulated business, and B, if the unregulated business has losses, tough luck, the shareholder eats it.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Okay. So, Greg, you want to respond?
Yes. I feel I've been dissed, but I'm going to get over that. I'll address the three items that came forward. In terms of competitiveness, I agree with Steve. The answer would be, why not? I mean, if we can bring value, if we can bring lower prices and additional value to our customers, why wouldn't we be allowed to be into competitive market? Now, obviously, there need to be boundaries. There need to be rules. And some of those boundaries and rules exist already with respect to the affiliate relationship code that's in place in Ontario through the Ontario Energy Board, which goes directly to the subsidization question. No, the regulated business should not subsidize the unregulated and vice versa. So I don't agree that there should be subsidies. And how do you regulate? I think the other question was, how do you if you're going to let the regulated business get into some of the playing field, how do you kind of how do you deal with that? And I think that is one of the million-dollar questions that I don't have an answer for, but I think it's something we should start thinking about now. If that is a potential future and that's coming down the road, let's get together now and start talking about it with large number of groups, people who are in this audience, regulators, utilities, gas companies, independent businesses, and talk about what is it we need to put in place such that this could work.
Okay, I spent like the last 30 years talking about this level playing field issue for various clients and myself. The thing that has come through it consistently is many utilities saying, look, we can offer these competitive businesses at a low marginal cost because we have a cost base already in place. We have a whole lot of stuff in place already. So our marginal cost is very low, and that benefits the customers of those competitive businesses, and it benefits the customers of the regulated business, because both of them get that economy of scope. So I'm going to put the question then to you, Ken. Is that a legitimate argument? Is there some truth to that utilities should be allowed to use their monopoly to advantage in a competitive marketplace?
Yeah, I think, I think there's a social good from doing that, as long as they don't have an unfair advantage over their competitors. I mean, that's to me is the big concern when the utilities get into, like gas marketing in the U.S. A lot jurisdictions have what's called retail choice. And in many of those, the local utility actually has an affiliate, a marketing affiliate that sells gas, okay? In a lot of cases, those affiliates are the biggest supplier of gas to the customers, okay, that decide to go for gas from other than their local distribution company. Yeah, you have to sort of ask the question, is there a reason, are they more efficient? I mean, if they are more efficient than their competitors and they don't have unfair advantage, then yeah, that's fine. I don't think how you could dispute that. I think the issue is whether, the environment is such that, they don't have, they don't have an advantage over their competitors. An issue that's come up recently was solar PV. Some utilities in the states actually own those facilities and they rate base them. And I think legitimately the other solar vendors are saying, well, that's unfair because they could just socialize the cost. They put it in rate base, all the customers pay for it. And, that lowers the risks. So I think in that situation, for example, there is not a level playing field. Now you have to, this is an issue. What's a level playing field? I've done enough studies on stuff like combined heat and power, solar, other technologies. These vendors say, well, it's uneven. The utility has an advantage. But if you look sort of closely at, these situations, a lot of times it's not that the utility has an advantage, but the new technology sort of has a higher cost. It's relatively new, so their costs are higher. And they want to gain an advantage with the regulators and the policymakers to give them a subsidy. I mean, that happens a lot. Net metering is really the crux of the argument in the states. The solar people are saying you get rid of net metering, that's just a barrier to us entering, this market. The utility wants to take it away and puts us at a disadvantage. That's unfair. But on the other hand, when you look at net metering, it's based on deliver average price. And if you look at it closely, it's actually, at least in my opinion, and a lot of people would disagree, it's a subsidy for solar. So it's a sort of uneven, playing field in favor of the solar. Because, for example, in Hawaii, a lot of solar there, and the commission, I think, rightly decided recently that we got to go away from net metering. The surplus power that the solar, customers sell back to the utility should be based on wholesale price, not retail price. That's the proper price, all right? So that's, again, it's sort of one example where, people disagree, who has the advantage, who has the unfair advantage. Is it, the utility that wants to get rid of net metering? It's a barrier, it's an artificial barrier. Or the fact that if you do have net metering, it's a subsidy to the, to the solar people. So that's what makes this stuff so interesting. That's why I've been in this for decades, because there's no clear answer.
So here's a question that sort of flows from that, but looks at the issue of competitive businesses from the other side. The question is, as a publicly owned LDC, how do you ensure that your ventures into DER and I guess other competitive businesses don't pose unwarranted risks to your ratepayers or your municipal taxpayers? And maybe we'll start with Greg.
I think that's it's a very valid concern in terms of any LDC venturing into the non-regulated side, and in this one in particular venturing into the DER competitive area. How do you protect the ratepayers from risk? There may be the need for some sort of ring fencing that may be necessary to be put in place. But that needs to be carefully thought through. I don't have a super answer for that right now, but that does need to be.
Do you think the Affiliate Relationships Code goes far enough to protect the ratepayers? There's 20 people from the OEB here, by the way.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that, and I see every one of them right now. Yeah, so the affiliate relationship code does work. Yes, it does deal with these situations. But if you're going to fundamentally change the business model and you're going to let the regulated LDC get involved in competitive DER, then I think you need to take a look at the rules that surround that to ensure that they're strong enough and can deal with situations that may come up, many of which I couldn't even think of right now.
Okay. Ken, you want to respond to that? How do you protect your ratepayers or your municipal taxpayers?
Ring fencing is one. You know, you sort of structurally separate this business from the regulated, entity, and you make sure that the ratepayers of the regulated entity is protected. They're not, if this other entity happens to fail, then it's the shareholders, it's not the customers of the regulated entity that's responsible for that. Yeah, if you look at codes of conduct, that's what they're called in the States. It governs the relationship between a utility and an affiliate. And a lot of these rules are pretty strict. And, over time, there's been some violations of those rules, but generally, if the regulatory agency enforces them properly, it does avoid these problems.
Steve, you want to talk to that?
Yeah, I think the affiliate relationship code in Ontario, at least as it pertains to gas utilities, I think that works well today. I think it's pretty well understood. I don't think it needs to be revised or revamped in any way. But in terms of Enbridge, I think it's somewhat different of an environment in that our shareholder isn't a municipality. Enbridge is a widely held company. Probably much of that capital is held by pension plans, investment funds, entities like that. At a very high level, the riskier the proposition, the higher the rate of return that's going to be demanded by our parent company to reflect that risk. And in some cases, if we can't demonstrate that we're going to mitigate those risks to a satisfactory extent, we just won't go ahead with those lines of business. So it's a very, very rigid and strict set of controls we have around our investment review policy and what actually gets approved and what doesn't get approved. And so I think there's a huge amount of discipline there that makes sure that we manage the risk of the business in an appropriate way. From the ratepayer standpoint, I think the affiliate relationship code goes a long way to ring fence those activities in such a way that they wouldn't be put at risk.
Gord, do you want to comment on
this? Part of my earlier comment was I think the LDCs have an important role to play and will for a long time. And to that end, I don't believe that the regulated businesses should be allowed to participate in competitive marketplaces or competitive offerings. With some exceptions in Ontario, the vast majority of the LDCs are not well governed. They're run by essentially appointed members of council to a board that in most cases has virtually no diversity and don't understand the businesses which they're the custodians of. And I think there's just an ununderstood and unappreciated risk with respect to letting those businesses enter into a marketplace that has so much risk. We welcome the opportunity to work with utilities that understand that and look to develop opportunities outside of their regulated businesses to not put those assets, those critical community assets at risk, and would be opposed to cases where regulated utilities were exposing their shareholders and communities to risk by doing that kind of business inside the regulated business.
As much as I'd like to follow up on the governance thing you mentioned, I won't. We have time for one more question. I'm going to ask this question, which is maybe the most difficult. We'll start with you, Ken, I think, because you have the experience in telecom where the ILECs, the incumbents, were under siege from the CLECs, the competitive local exchange companies. And I don't remember all the other acronyms. And what happened there and what economic theory suggests is that in a period of change in a sector, some companies have to die so that others will survive. To what extent do you think that's true in the wires business here?
Well, yeah, I'm not, an expert on telecom. I'm sorry I mentioned it before, but no. But what basically happened, the regulators did allow, because there was this, intense competition. Of course, in telephone, the technology changed, to me, it's much more profound than for electric. But the regulators realized, too, that, to compete, the incumbent companies had to have more flexibility. I think that's sort of maybe something to be learned. Like I mentioned before, price cap regulation allowed pricing flexibility, for the telecoms to compete with these new entrants. And also, in telephone, you have more value-added services. People talk about value-added services for electric, and there is some potential for that, but it was, much more profound for telecom. So I sort of dispute whether the local telecoms, went under. I mean, they did, they had sort of revamped what they did, certainly. I mean, the Bell companies a lot of them are still around, but they're, they're not selling landlines so much, but they're into other types of businesses. That's sort of that's a lesson in cable, too. When satellite TV entered the market, companies like Comcast, they developed a new business model. They provided new services, internet, other services to their customers. So maybe sort of the lesson there and with the telecom is that, maybe one way to deal with that is to loosen it up for the utilities so that they're able to compete, but yet at the same time to protect the ratepayers that still want traditional service from their from the utility.
Gord, do some utilities have to die so that the others can survive?
So I think, for better or for worse, we're not going to let them die here in Ontario. I think they'll continue to struggle, and there are a number of Ontario LDCs, almost exclusively smaller ones, that provide virtually no dividend to their shareholder and are hanging on by a dear thread. I'm a Toronto Hydro customer, and I would like nothing better than for Toronto Hydro to be the one organization I can call for help as a consumer. Unfortunately, that's just not the case. I call them with billing issues almost exclusively. And I think most Ontarians would feel the same way, that they would love their utilities to do more. The unfortunate reality is that most utilities that have gone into that domain have failed. And I would certainly hope that we're not letting regulated utilities fail. But certainly if they venture into the unregulated space and want to compete, they should have to live or die the same way everyone else in the industry does.
Greg, are we going to see large-scale disruption in the next decade?
Speaking for myself, I say yes. I think we will see it in the next decade. And to address the two questions you put, I think there may be some utilities that die, but I think you'll see more amalgamation, especially as the complexities of running the electricity sector becomes more complex. I think you'll see that. But I also would like to agree with the comment Ken that made. This is another way of dealing that, maybe to loosen up some of the rules around what the regulated business can do.
Steve, want to comment?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the ways that the issue of competition amongst utilities and other businesses can be addressed is through partnering type arrangements and working cooperatively. I think we have one example case in point. We have a collaboration agreement in place with the Ontario Geothermal Association. Another example I think that Jay's very familiar with is our third-party billing program, where we provide a billing service on the utility bill for over 100 different entities right now. Some of them are very big, some of them are very small, but we managed to work out an arrangement through a consultative process through at the OEB. And that goes back now for about 10 years through several iterations, and it's worked quite successfully in terms of providing a benefit to our ratepayers, also providing a small benefit to our shareholders as well. So I think there are cases in point that show that we can work together with parties that could be competitors or might appear to be competitors, but to work in a collaborative way that makes sense for everybody.
Thanks, Steve. Are you lurking for me to stop?
Almost.
So thank you. I'll turn it over to Sean.
Well, thank you, Jay and friends, for a stimulating and almost provocative panel.
Almost.
Well, I just sat in the audience and listened, and I must say that Gord and Greg, I think we might want to just get you aside and have a little sub-panel to see how we can resolve what one of my old friends would call a creative tension on the role of certain players. But very, very good, and I appreciate the effort and the candor and the interaction. 15-minute break, and we will come back in 15 minutes. Ably led by Cynthia Chaplin for a final panel on what all of this means for the regulatory and policy regimes.